From monopoly to oligopoly of violence, exploration of a four-point hypothesis regarding organized and organic militia in Kenya. This is research work that was funded by UNDP Kenya office in collaboration with the National Steering Committee at the Office of the President, and it is work that we at the consulting house have done for the last 2 years. These are some of the preliminary findings, but the actual publication is to be found online in our website. It was conducted by Dr. Katumanga and myself as the lead researchers, and we are releasing it now in March 2014, although some of the data actually dates back a while ago. We were bothered by three things regarding militia proliferation in Kenya. One, why is a state either absent or abstaining? Absence we can understand because of distance decay between the state and where militia groups operate from. But abstinence, state abstinence, and in particular the abstinence of the police in some instances bothered us. Number two, we were bothered by the likelihood that we might have experienced a shift from monopoly to oligopoly of violence. That is, that the state is no longer the only supplier of violence in the country, and that there are possibilities that criminal groups and others could be supplying this violence. And we asked the question, why? And then three, we were bothered by the relationship between militia groups, the police, and the politicians. And we asked the question, who is beholden to who? And we attempt to answer these three questions in this research work. We engaged a total of 250 researchers. Some of them were slum dwellers, others were militia members, gang members from different gangs, and we worked with them to be able to break into some of their circuits, and we were able to interview 8,000 respondents in 15 counties, and the results were fed into a system that gave us different models, and we also used GPS coordinates to be able to locate some of the militia hoods in the different areas that we sampled for this particular research work. The militia count, we turned in 238 militia groups in the 15 counties. This means that if we are scared of Mungiki or Al-Shabaab, there probably are other soft-core groups that could morph into such groups, and these groups are 238 across the entire country, and they are divided into what we call the hardcore militia groups, and these are the militarized ones like Al-Shabaab, and the softcore militia groups, these are the marketized groups whose job is basically to do extraction, and then there are the no-core militia groups, and these are the ones, the vigilante groups that are actually engaged by the rogue elements within the state, and in fact rogue elements not within the state in general but within the police force in particular. The spread of militia, in every 4 square kilometers you go to around the entire country, our model showed us that 1 kilometer is infected by a militia group of sorts. And these militia groups are either organized or organic. Organized militia groups are the ones that are criminal essentially, but organic militia groups are constituted to protect community against the organized ones. So anywhere you go to 4 kilometers in whatever direction, one of them you will encounter a militia group according to this particular statistical crunching. But for every militia group that is dominant, there is a counterforce. This is what we call the law of gang polarity. Mungiki is a dominant force outside central Kenya, is counterforced by Taliban, or it is Taliban is a counterforce. MRC for a long time in Mombasa had its counterforce as Sungu, and similarly Angola Msumbiji, which has now re-emerged in some parts of Kisumu and Kakamega as the Baghdad Boys, its counterforce. So what this finding tells us is that whenever there's a dominant group, another softer group will emerge to be able to counter the aggression of the next one, or of the dominant group. Regarding police-militia ratio, for every 100 militia members, there are 20 policemen in general, which is a ratio of 1 to 5. But this ratio is not true in all instances. Kisumu has 4 policemen manning 1 militia member, for instance, because Kisumu's militia groups are more colorful than Syria's. They are more colorful and they have lesser force. And although there are many, but they're not armed. So every 4 policemen manning 1 militia group, 1 militia member in Kisumu. Kakamega has 16 policemen manning 1 militia member, essentially. But Nairobi, this changes. 6 militia members to every 1 policeman. Nakuru has 4 militia members to every 1 policeman, while Nzoia has 5 militia members to 1 policeman. The militia and gun permeation. Out of every 20 armed policemen, there are 30 armed militia members. This calculates to a gun ratio of 2 to 3, which means that essentially the militia groups are overgunned compared to the armed policemen, or rather that they actually outgun the armed policemen. But we must note here also that the militia groups are not organized. So as such, they cannot necessarily overpower the police force. Although also instances of the police hiring their guns, the militia groups, is something that we came across in the research work. Regarding the militia and police symbiosis, we noticed that out of every 4 policemen, at least 1 is involved in militia activities or works in cahoots with militia groups across the country. And the police symbiosis with militia, in our view, is as a result of police abstinence or police absence. Police absence can be excused because maybe we don't have sufficient policemen. But abstinence happens either because the police are overpowered by militia members, or it happens because the police are working in cahoots with militia members. And our take is that the working in cahoots is more the dominant mode of abstinence. Regarding distance decay, the closer you are to an administration camp or police station, the higher the likelihood that you will encounter a militia attack of sorts. That finding came to us as a big surprise, but that is what our regression modeling told us. But the closer the attack also is to an administration police unit or administration camp, the higher the likelihood that the police response will be suboptimal, or it will happen much lesser. And this is probably because the police and the administration, the chief's camp or the administration police for the most part, have been working in competition over crime. And we hope that this will change with the merger of the 2 of them under the police service. Now we turn to very specific militia profiles of each of the counties that we looked at. Mombasa. The MRG, or Mombasa Republican Guard, was the dominant group for a long time in Mombasa, but we think this has now been taken over by Al-Shabaab and the different variations of Al-Shabaab. But the counterforce in Mombasa, which is pretty much an organic group in this particular county, has emerged as Sungu Sungu, and there are many other variations of it. We must note also that Sungu Sungu is just a franchise. It is not necessarily the same group that we find in Kisii or in Eldoret. This is just a group concocted by some people for purposes of forestalling the aggression of either Al-Shabaab or MRC, especially during the last election. And here are the statistics regarding the actual numbers of these groups in Mombasa. But take note of what we're calling the no-core militia, which take 50%, and they are as important as MRC and as Sungu Sungu. The no-core militia are groups that are forming, vigilante groups that have been constituted either by the police or constituted by the administration, the chiefs, as it were. And In our view, both of them, either the red bloc of the NOCO or the other two militia groups, are dangerous. The militia groups of Nairobi, they are basically as follows: Mungiki, Taliban, Kamjesh, Sungusungu, those are the dominant ones. But there are others, like the Kamukunji Pressure, the 42 Brothers, Siafu, and the 12 Disciples. But Mungiki is the dominant militia group in Nairobi, accounting for up to about 43% of the crime share in Nairobi. But we must also mention a group like the 12 Disciples is tethered around the chief's camp in one of the slum areas, one of the informal settlements in Nairobi. And this particular group is also said to be giving some kind of support to the administration police where and if necessary in some of the areas in the slums. And here are the graphs, pie chart, you can see it right there. And Nairobi doesn't have a lot of vigilante groups for some reason. And I think it's probably because the militia groups, some of the militia groups, especially the youth groups, might have been co-opted by the administration police or might have been co-opted also by the police force itself for purposes of working on criminal activities. The militia groups of Nakuru, Mungiki is probably the most dominant in Nakuru, but what we found most fascinating in Nakuru was that 85% of the people we interviewed in Nakuru told us that they don't consider Mungiki illegitimate, although government considers it illegitimate. And there we are, Mungiki 51%. But again, take note of the no-co militia groups. These are groups that we could not completely tell who the owners were. And that's why hypothetically we link them to either the police or the chief in the different areas that we went to. But you can also see in Nakuru we have groups like the Kalenjin Warriors, and SLDF has also has seemingly also migrated into this particular space. The militia groups of Kisumu are colorful, as I said earlier, but Baghdad Boys is the most dominant of these groups. But two new entrants have emerged in Kisumu, Angola Msumbiji and Mungiki, and they are critical in this particular marketplace right now in Kisumu. Here's a pie chart for this particular group. You can see Mungiki at 11%, Angola Msumbiji at 13%, and Baghdad Boys at 20%. But take note again of the no-co militia and the vigilante groups. Again, these are the groups that are actually designed specifically to provide for certain crime or criminal activities that feed into the rogue elements within government, in our view. The militia groups of Kakamega, after 2008 post-election violence, Angola and Msumbiji seem to have been revived in Kakamega. And when we asked the question whether the community thought it was a legal or an illegal group, 52% of them told us that they view it basically as a legal group that gives them protection in the absence of agents of the state, especially the police. And you can see right there, Angola Msumbiji has the share of 32%, 35%, but the vigilante groups again and the no-co militia who are co-opted by certain elements, you can see what figures they basically turned in. Together they constitute almost 51% of the crime market share in this particular county. The militia groups of Wasingishu, these ones are many, and they also mirror image the different communities in Wasingishu. But Mungiki and the Kalenjin Warriors are the main ones. But there is also a presence of SLDF in Wasingishu, which is probably a sleeper cell that seemed to have come there from Mount Elgon, in a sense. Here are the figures: 54% Mungiki in Eldoret, Kalenjin warriors, about 18%, vigilante groups, about 17%, and so on. Nzoia. The only significant militia group in Nzoia was SLDF. This had a high level of legitimacy. In a sense, 25% is pretty high. But there was another group that came out that was a little curious for us. Those are the police reservists, accounting for 50% of the groups that were named as engaging in militia activities in Nzoia County. And here again, the different figures. You can see again the no-core militia groups that have absolutely no face. We don't know who the owners are, occupying up to about 40% of the criminal market share. And these are the groups, again, we think are beholden to the rogue elements within the government and especially within the police force. Bungoma was a curious case because this is the only place where a militia group has attracted the full force of government. And this is where SLDF was located at some point. We think that SLDF has revived in a sense. And we have located it in a number of Nzoia, in Nakuru, and now in this place. But basically a weekend force, as it were. But there are militia groups in Bungoma percolating from Kisumu and Kakamega are Angola, Msumbiji, and Baghdad boys. Although Mungiki and Taliban are still forming in this county as well. Here are the figures. SLDF accounted for 51%. And the no-core militia, again, mirror imaging the former militia groups, accounting for 39%. Our conclusion, therefore, from this study is that there is an imagined fellowship of three. And this is a fellowship between militia, the chief's camp, and the police. The general impression that you get is that the militia groups are actually a function of political engineering, but that impression is wrong in our view. The politicians are more beholden to militia groups than the vice versa. That the connection between the police and the chief's camp and militia is more lethal than that between the politicians and the militia groups. 2, there is what we call the fellowship of two. That is one between the militia groups and the politicians. And that relationship, in our view, is symbiotic. Politicians depend on militia to do bad politics and not the reverse. But militia exists also to engage in illicit markets, and bad politics is only one market segment of it. So in our view, getting rid of rogue politicians or acts of rogue politics will not solve the militia problem completely, because the militia groups will only go and engage in other marketized activities. Recommendations, we have only 2. We cannot give more than that. Number 1, the police and the militia joined at the hip, in our view. Radical surgery in the police force will only solve half the militia problem. That is A. So we recommend radical surgery, but will only solve some of the problems. And we also recommend that we think that the surgery happening in the police force is insufficient. It needs to be more radical than it is right now. Number 2, the second half of the problem should be resolved through a government program of social regimentation of young people. In the absence of such an organized program, the militia will regiment the youth. And this must be done, in our view, urgently.